All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we are cracking open history's ultimate cold case, and we're going to apply the rigorous tools of historical abductive reasoning to do it. Now, whether you approach this topic from a strictly secular, skeptical standpoint or a traditional one, the sources we're analyzing today frame this historical challenge perfectly. We're going to look at 8 universally agreed upon historical facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and then we'll test the 5 competing theories that attempt to explain them. We're not here to preach, we are just here to weigh the data, exactly as an impartial historian would.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll establish the historical data points, outline our evaluation rubric, test out the rejected theories, analyze the hallucination contender, evaluate the bodily resurrection, and finally deliver the philosophical verdict. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The historical data points, 8 universally cited facts.
Now, any serious historical explanation absolutely has to account for all 8 of these universally cited data points. If a theory ignores even one, it fails. Period. We've got the early creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, the empty tomb, and post-death appearances to both individuals and groups. But here's where it gets really interesting. We also have the totally unexpected conversions of hostile skeptics, like Paul and James. Add to that the followers' sheer willingness to die for this, the incredibly embarrassing cultural detail of naming women as the first witnesses, and the explosive, rapid origin of the Christian movement itself. It's like a giant puzzle where both hostile skeptics and devoted followers are uniquely intertwined in these very specific, verifiable events.
And look at this incredibly compressed time frame. Critical scholars across the entire ideological spectrum date that 1 Corinthians 15 creed to within just 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion. We're not talking about folklore that's slowly evolved over centuries. This is a highly formulated creed summarizing the appearances, and it was circulating in real time, almost immediately after the events.
Moving on to Section 2, the evaluation rubric, basically the rules of the detective's whiteboard. So how do historians actually weigh these competing explanations? Well, they use abductive reasoning. You might know it as the inference to the best explanation. We're focusing strictly on 3 criteria here. First, explanatory scope. Does the theory actually cover all 8 data points? Second, explanatory power. Does the theory make the data natural and expected instead of feeling forced? And third, parsimony. Does the theory require the fewest assumptions?
This brings us to a really crucial concept: ad hoc assumptions. This is essentially the analytical linchpin for everything that follows. An ad hoc assumption is basically an unproven patch. When a theory hits a dead end, you kind of have to invent an unverified secondary story just to make your original hypothesis work. Make sense? So naturally, the more patches a theory needs, the weaker it becomes, historically.
Section 3. The rejected historical theories. We're going to look at 3 hypotheses that modern critical scholarship has largely abandoned because they completely fail our rubric.
First up is the stolen body theory. This is the claim that the disciples knowingly stole the body and just spread a lie. Sure, this neatly explains the empty tomb, but skeptics and scholars agree that it catastrophically fails almost everywhere else. I mean, it cannot explain the conversions of outsiders like Paul and James, who were definitely not part of any inner circle. And psychologically speaking, humans just do not willingly undergo torture and martyrdom for a lie they explicitly invented themselves, especially when there's absolutely no tangible money or power to be gained.
What's really fascinating here is how the culturally embarrassing detail of women being the first witnesses completely shatters that conspiracy theory. In patriarchal first-century Judea, female testimony was frankly largely devalued. If a group of conspirators were trying to invent a myth to gain followers, they definitely wouldn't choose women as their star witnesses. It's a phenomenally poor strategic choice, unless, of course, they were awkwardly reporting exactly what actually happened.
Next, we test the swoon theory. This is the idea that Jesus simply survived the crucifixion, recovered in the cold tomb, and presented himself to his followers. But guys, this requires massive medical ad hoc assumptions. You essentially have to believe a man survived professional Roman executioners, a spear wound, and 3 days in a stone tomb with 0 medical care, only to somehow miraculously appear totally healthy.
Sociologically, this one fails too. The 19th century historian David Friedrich Strauss hit the nail on the head. He noted that a battered, bleeding, half-dead survivor limping out of a tomb in desperate need of a doctor would inspire pity, not worship as a glorified conqueror of death. It completely lacks the explanatory power needed to spark a massive, triumphant religious movement. The third rejected idea is the legend theory, the idea that the story just evolved over generations like folklore. But this crashes right into our timeline. Sweeping myth-making requires generations to pass in order to overwrite historical memory. You literally cannot have legendary development when the core claims are being formulated and passed around in real time by named living eyewitnesses. It just doesn't fit the data.
Which brings us to Section 4, the hallucination contender, the naturalistic consensus. Because those first three theories fail, we now turn to the skeptic's strongest counterpoint and the prevailing secular view in modern scholarship, the hallucination hypothesis. The argument here is that Jesus remained dead, and the post-death appearances were actually profound, subjective, psychological experiences. And to be fair, it has strong explanatory power for individual convictions. Skeptics argue that deep grief triggered visions for the original disciples, and that extreme internal guilt over persecuting Christians manifested as a spontaneous vision for Paul. But here is the massive catch. Hallucinations are strictly internal. They happen in the mind. They do not empty tombs. So to make this theory work, secular historians are forced to build a highly complex, compound theory made up of independent patches. Let's break it down. First, you have to assume the body was separately lost or moved. Second, to explain the group appearances, you have to assume medically anomalous mass suggestibility, where multiple people hallucinated the exact same thing at the exact same time. And third, you need entirely different psychological triggers for skeptics like James, who wasn't grieving at all. Can it work? Maybe, but it requires a staggering number of unproven patches. Section 5, the bodily resurrection, the traditional consensus. Let's evaluate this hypothesis, the claim that God physically raised Jesus using the exact same impartial rubric. This theory actually reveals maximum explanatory scope and power. It natively provides a single direct cause for every single piece of historical data. Think about it. It perfectly explains an empty tomb. It circumvents the hallucination theory's fatal flaw by easily explaining physical group appearances. It serves as the ultimate, undeniable catalyst for the shocking conversions of hostile outsiders like Paul and James. And it accounts for those embarrassing female witnesses simply because, well, that is exactly how the event unfolded. And internally, it requires literally zero ad hoc assumptions to connect the dots. You don't need a lost body theory, plus a mass hysteria theory, plus a guilt trigger theory for Paul. One single event successfully causes all the historical ripples we see in that first century. Finally, Section 6, the final philosophical verdict, the methodological crux. Looking at our scorecards summarizing these 5 theories, the bodily resurrection is technically the most comprehensive historical fit in terms of scope and power. But we have to examine a really crucial caveat regarding that third rule, parsimony, or having the fewest ad hoc assumptions. This is where the debate hits a massive wall. Enter strict methodological naturalism. This is the rule that history can only evaluate natural causes. Under this framework, a miracle is automatically disqualified right out of the gate as the biggest ad hoc assumption possible. Therefore, secular historians are logically forced to accept the messy, compound hallucination theory. Why? Because combining 3 unverified natural events is still considered mathematically more probable than accepting one supernatural one. And this beautifully illustrates the methodological impasse at the heart of this cold case. If you hold strictly to methodological naturalism, you're forced to rely on a complex stacking of natural patches. But if you look at it from an open epistemological vantage point, where God's existence and potential intervention are permitted as part of the historical background knowledge, well, the resurrection suddenly requires virtually zero assumptions. Under this specific philosophical framework, it elegantly unifies all the evidence without needing a single compound patch. Ultimately, evaluating these ancient claims leaves us with a profound modern dilemma. The data points themselves are widely agreed upon, but the explanation you land on might actually say more about your worldview than the evidence itself. It leaves us asking, do the artificial boundaries of our methodologies dictate the historical truths we are willing to accept? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep following the data.